Okay, so to get started, we are just going to let you know a couple things about HSIs in general, just to give you sort of the broadest strokes here. So there's just under 600 HSIs right now in the US, and we have 20%, almost 20% of higher ed is HSIs. We're the largest group of minority serving institutions, is sort of the umbrella that HSIs fall under. And what's really interesting about it is what's on the right side of the slide, which is that 3/4 of all Latinx, Hispanic identified students in the US attend an HSI. So what this means is that we're a small percentage of higher ed, but we serve the vast majority of Hispanic students. So what that means is that Hispanic students are highly concentrated into HSIs, and I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind. And the definition of an HSI, or the designation, what does it mean? So just so we're all on the same page, what it means is that a quarter or more, it's a percentage designation, that a quarter or more of the undergraduate enrollment in the college or university has students who are identifying as Hispanic or Latinx. So this is like good and bad. This is a problematic definition because it doesn't really tell you much about the college itself. So in this respect, HSIs are very different than mission-based colleges such as HBCUs or tribal colleges that are designated not by enrollment, but by mission. So that's something to really think about as you keep going in your HSI work yourself, is how is your own HSI really looking at just being an enrollment definition, or what it's actually doing for its mission to serve Hispanic students. So we're going to make that designation a lot in the programs that you're taking with us, but that's just a fact for you to know, is that becoming an HSI really has nothing to do with the mission. It has only to do with the numbers of students that are there. And then the last piece of this that we want to set as a foundation before going further is that HSIs became a designation way back in 1992. This is not a new designation. And what happened is that for decades before 1992, we had, in the 1980s and in the early 1990s, we had organizations like LULAC, MALDEF, we had Congress people that were advocating for the designation, but that it really started in a grassroots way from institutional leaders in Texas and New Mexico. So that means college presidents, vice presidents were gathering and going, look, we need to be heard and we need to be seen on the federal level. And not only that, we want designated money to help us because we are the ones that are serving a predominant Hispanic students and we are doing great equity work. So they were the ones that really advocated for this. I just want to let you know that this wasn't a bunch of legislators sitting together and saying, yeah, let's do this out of nowhere. So again, this is something that I want you to recognize, that the designation didn't come out of some kind of benevolence from the federal government. It was really a long advocacy effort with a lot of struggle, and we want to honor that those are the shoulders we stand on here, in that we had these college presidents who were getting together and organizing in that way. So what you see to the right is that there were different funding sources that were starting to be designated, and those all happened at different times, but you are probably maybe familiar, if you're in your HSI grant, that you have either Title III funds, Title V funds, and now there are two more. There's NSF and USDA funds that are set aside for Hispanic serving institutions. So all of this to the right here is continuing on, but there is significant money for HSIs, but if you dig a little bit deeper into the research on that, it turns out that HSIs are growing at a faster pace than the money is being allocated, which means that we are a growing number of institutions competing against one another for sometimes a flatlined amount of dollars from year to year. So that's creating some tension, and it's important to know that in the situation we're in now, in the 2020s, that we're now advocating for additional dollars for these same pools because we're having more and more HSIs come on the scene and compete for these funds, which isn't what we want to do. Okay, so we also have some stats here to get you more familiar with the population, the demographic population that you might be serving. And really, these are just to give you a broad stroke here. Again, you would want to be looking at your own geographic region, your own students, and seeing what the diversity is amongst your students and not assume that they're a monolith. So the main point here is that Hispanic and Latinx population in the U.S. is very diverse. It's diverse racially, it's diverse by country of origin, it's diverse by language. And so students' experiences, you should not expect that they are the same and that you can serve them in the same way, which is what it also is beautiful about HSI work, but it's also complex for that reason. So we recommend that you go to Pew Research Center. They have a great research arm and that has lots of these kinds of tables where they're updated all the time. You can be clicking around. We have one here that shows the country origin, but you can also see that you can look at foreign-born statistics and median age of populations. We also have found things like this where it shows geography growth. So if you just look at the geography growth size of the circles here, you can see that some areas have had much larger growth than others. Basically, you can see the coasts, of course. But also what's fascinating about the HSI world, especially from the Escala lens when we work nationally, is that we've seen a lot more HSIs pop up in the Midwest. And you can see that some of those circles are quite large, especially in Illinois, which has a lot of HSIs now in the Chicagoland area. Massachusetts, New Jersey are all showing a lot of growth. So it'd be interesting if you go into the demographic charts that they have in Pew and see what the HSI population increase has been for your region in the last decade. And last but not least, we have another chart from Pew that just shows the immigration versus U.S. born growth of the Hispanic and Latinx population. And we put this in here because I think it's important that we understand the myths that pervade, and we need to break those and dispel the myths. And one of them is about immigration driving Latinx student growth, and that is actually not true. Since the 2000s, just by the numbers alone, you can see how much immigration has dropped off for a number of reasons, but that the birth rate is really driving, U.S. birth rate is driving the increases in the number of Latinx folks in the U.S. And then, so what's happening in the education world? The next couple slides really set a foundation for where HSIs get their growth, and it comes from the K-12 population, of course. So we have a nice map that's red colored that we picked this out from Haku that has a great interactive website where you can click on this red map and see actually where your Hispanic serving school districts are. So as an HSI, you are probably surrounded by a large number of school districts that are even more densely Hispanic than your HSI. So I encourage you again to go into this website and click around and see how the Hispanic serving school districts are feeding into your HSI. And the next slide shows that the percentage of high school completers who are enrolled in college has been increasing for Hispanic folks in the last 2 decades. And you can see on this chart that Hispanic students are now matching white students in their educational enrollment and post-secondary. And now if we would keep going on this chart, we would see that Hispanic students for some of these years, close to 2020, are actually exceeding white students in their percent enrollment in post-secondary after high school. So what does this mean? That we have great educational aspirations, we have higher high school degree attainment, we have dense Hispanic serving school districts, we have growth in Hispanics, and all of this has led to the growth of HSIs. So this next chart shows the geographic location by congressional districts of HSIs in general. So that doesn't mean that they are right there, but if you click again into Haku's interactive map, you can find your HSI and the congressional district that it resides in. So you'll see, of course, that this is the Southwest is the predominant place, but you're again seeing some cropping up in places that people wouldn't expect, like Tennessee, Louisiana, Oregon now has a few HSIs. So these are all showing the growth. And I would say in the next decade or two, we're going to see that there's HSIs everywhere. So we're really, if you're in an HSI right now or an EHSI, you're ahead of the curve, and the practices that you find are helping your students are going to be the ones that are going to be asked for by these colleges that are going to come online later. So that gave us a little picture of how HSIs have come to exist, but it doesn't really give us a good picture of what was going on before these 1980s, 1990s when the designation was happening. And really, if we back up and go into the early 1900s all the way up to 1980 when people got the idea for having a designation, it's a story that's filled with segregated classrooms. Students that were segregated by language was a big reason that a lot of districts used to take students out and put them in separate classrooms or even in separate buildings that were inferior. So the history of Latinx education in the U.S. is really filled with exclusion and segregation in inferior education and inequities. So it's kind of a forgotten element. It's not often brought up in HSI work. And I think it's important that your own HSI looks at its own history and who it was welcoming in at the very beginning. If it's 100 years old, were Hispanic students allowed to attend? Were school districts segregated? And that all of those play a big role in why you still see inequities in your school districts in the preparation of your Hispanic students, and why they may come in not having the same resources and the same educational opportunities that white students have at your HSIs. So in looking at the inequities that you're currently working with, we always encourage you to look back and look at the history so that it gives you a lens about where systemic racism was creating these inequities, and that it's not on the students to educate you about these things, and that these organizations listed on this slide, like LULAC, your MECHA group, MALDEF, if you have a United Farm Workers nearby, a lot of these organizations have historical records, and they also have great websites where they've documented some of the advocacy cases they've been part of. So we encourage you to dig a little deeper in your own HSI's history so that you understand really how the community has been served or excluded in your own HSI. So last but not least, we're going to just touch really briefly on servingness and what is servingness. So if we look at this slide that compares 2- and 4-year institutions, just to give you a framework on, okay, here's all the ways that we have HSIs, here's what the designation means, but how well are we serving, right? So that's why the serving word has come up. If we're Hispanic serving, that means we need to be doing what, right? And if we just look at graduation, we are obviously that would be a part of serving, right? That students are actually attaining the degrees that they came in to earn. So if we look at this data, you can see that there's inequities between white and Hispanic students in HSIs. And this is from Excelencia, which is another great resource that you can check out. Every year they have different infographics that they're updating on some of these college stats. So between 2 and 4, you can see that the gap is much bigger at 4-year institutions. It's a 12% difference in the graduation rates. And you can also see that even between the 2 and the 4-year, we have a significant number of Hispanic students that leave without attaining any degree at all. And they're taking longer to degree, but that there's a chunk in that gray shaded area that leave with no degree. And that is a really troubling statistic that people are researching, trying to figure out best practices to keep students in school and also get them completed, because that's a huge inequity to be left with loans and financial aid issues that you don't even have your degree. One of the scholars that has been working a lot on servingness is Dr. Gina Garcia. And she has a couple books out. These are just two of them. But I like this quote because it kind of pinpoints what the problem has been, which is that, again, like going back to our initial slide, that if it's an enrollment designation, then becoming an HSI doesn't mean that you necessarily know what it means to serve. And the fact that these grant proposals, the discussions around being an HSI in the early days didn't include any terms for servingness or like definition of what that meant, then colleges were left to figure it out by themselves. And so she and other colleagues of hers in HSIs are really trying to figure out, are there frameworks that we can work towards? And I think HSIs are really craving having something substantial to work on. What are the practices? What are the mutually agreed upon definitions, right? And so I would point you towards these books. Some of them are great detailed case studies about how these HSIs went from enrolling to starting to serve, and frameworks that Dr. Garcia has started to flesh out based on her research with HSIs across the U.S. One of the ones that I want to point to is the fact that there are two ways that you can look at your servingness at your college, and their structures and indicators. And just looking at these two sides and these two colors, the green side is really like how the institution is structuring itself. That's why it's structures. So like your curriculum structures, how your grants are institutionalized as a structure. How are your mission and purpose statements reflecting and recognizing your large Latinx student population? And of course, compositional diversity is who's at the table, who's teaching, who's making decisions. But then there are these indicators that are almost like the outputs, like what's happening with students, how are you measuring, what's going on with disaggregated data, and how is it showing you that there's gaps are closing. So all of these are ways that you can use indicators to see how well you're doing as a serving HSI. So Dr. Garcia's argument is that you really need to be doing both. You really need to change the institutional structures, composition, and culture in order to improve your indicators. So it's a little bit of doing both at the same time, which is complex but really interesting work. And I'll just end that we have some key questions that you can be asking yourself as a practitioner is, again, to refresh you, when did you become an HSI, and how is the history being talked about, or where is it? Is it public information? Could you make it more well known how you became an HSI and what happened prior to that? How are we using our funds? Where is it institutionalizing? Are we using it to focus on our Latinx student inequities? And are there gaps, and what are we doing about it? What are the practices that are working for our student population? So these are really key questions that you can be starting to ask questions about when you're at the table, when you're working with your teams, to also keep up on what is happening in the HSI scene. So our last slide is just that you can rest assured that HSIs are really where equity is happening. So as long as we keep the pressure on and we keep working on what our best practices are, we're going to see these measures go up even further. So a couple of things on here are really promising that HSIs are making a big difference for Hispanic and Latinx students. One of them being is that we are, as a group, moving students, Hispanic communities, upwards in socioeconomic status, which is measured by that social mobility index. So 8 out of the 10 colleges and universities are HSIs. And that is because we are serving the students that have educational aspirations, but also come from underrepresented backgrounds. So we're trying to leave you on a good note because this is really, really important work. We want you to feel excited that you're in an HSI and that you get this opportunity to figure out what works for your students and to do this really complex but very interesting and engaging work around institutional culture and structure change. Thank you so much for listening. That's it for us, and we hope you dig deeper into these resources, and we look forward to working with you in our program.